Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. Donald Trump isn't backing down on his threat to hit Canada with 25% tariffs, but Canada is fighting back. Meet Meredith Lilly. She is an associate professor and Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University. And this is Daniel Schwanin. He is an award-winning economist and the senior vice president of the C.D. Howe Institute. They join us now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
We know it would be substantial, but Meredith, can we quantify the effect of Trump's tariffs and what they would have on the Canadian economy?
We don't know how big the tariffs will be. And we don't know if they're going to be 25% across the board, which is one of the things that has been threatened, or whether it will be a narrow, more sectoral approach. So there's a range of potential effects. But if it is broad, then we would be talking about a major hit to it would actually move our GDP. It would be a very significant impact on us economically.
Daniel, can we look at the last time Mr. Trump was in power to get a sense as to the economic impact? Can we look back to the triggers for the Great Depression when we looked at that insular nature of economics and what it did to the world economy?
That's actually a big debate in the United States, and the people who are now in charge, both in terms of the policy and the intellectual, the ideas behind it, assure us that it's not the same as it was then, because the United States now is over-consuming, but back then it was overproducing, and so it needed export markets. And now it's over-consuming, and it needs to bring back production back home to compensate for that, if you will, right? To bring the United States trade in balance, it needs to consume as much as it produces. So they want to repatriate factories, including from Canada. I think the intention is quite clear, back to the US and incur less of a deficit with all of their trade partners. In terms of now, just to be clear, we don't think that's a great idea. We think that's very misguided. We think that the US deficit is entrenched in something else in the US capacity or propensity to overconsume. So we agree on that, but we think that unfortunately, if they impose tariffs on all their trade partners, because of the integration of supply chains these days, they're going to hurt their own competitiveness, and they're not going to be able to increase their domestic production the way that they think they are. And I'll just add that it really depends on who they impose tariffs. We talk a lot about the impact of Canada. It's going to be severe if we're talking about 25% tariffs. So we're talking about million-plus jobs directly at stake here in our own economy. But it does depend also on what they do with the rest of the world.
It looks like we've sort of gathered Team Canada again, like we had to do back in 2015, 2016, to respond to Mr. Trump. Meredith, how would you rate Canada's response to the threat so far?
Well, Canada doesn't have a single team right now, and so in that respect, I don't know that Canada has a response. Certainly, Canadian officials at the federal level have been working for a long time to prepare for the potential of this, but it's difficult to respond to threats, particularly with President-elect Trump, because he is known to be unpredictable and to threaten one thing and do something slightly different in the end. Before we go any further, I want to be clear that any tariffs that are placed on Canada on day one through executive orders or some other process will violate our shared free trade agreement. And so, our first response should be, well, this is actually a violation of our trade agreement. They're illegal tariffs and they're not permitted. So that's one piece. But I think more generally, one of the real challenges that we have as a result of the political crisis in Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau signaling his resignation, except not actually resigning, and triggering a leadership process, the House of Commons isn't sitting, all of this actually creates a leadership vacuum. And as a result of that vacuum, other voices are seeking to be heard and compete for attention in the United States. I don't blame premiers who actually are meeting now to discuss some of the provincial level responses that they might have to tariffs. Because there's federal responses that we can have around tariffs, but then there's also the potential for controlling the export of things like natural resources, which really fall under provincial premiers. So that those premiers are now advancing their own ideas directly in Washington is something I think that we should expect given the circumstances. But it does create a little bit of confusion from the perspective of Washington about who speaks for Canada right now.
Well, with that in mind, I think you've intimated we're talking about Danielle Smith here. She went to Mar-a-Lago to speak to Trump directly as the one who holds the purse strings or the spigot controls, I suppose, on oil to a degree. Do individual premiers talking to Trump undermine a Team Canada effort?
I'm not actually talking about Premier Smith exclusively. There's a number of premiers who've been weighing in, and actually sure. Premier Ford has been doing it more than anyone. And I think that some of those interventions are frankly helpful to Canada. So this idea that they're that they're undermining Team Canada, I actually don't accept the premise of that because there is no Team Canada right now. And if I'm being fair to Premier Smith, she has spent the last, pretty much since she has been elected, Ottawa has not been friendly to her, has not been friendly to the oil and gas sector. And now if Ottawa is seeking to move in and use the oil and gas sector as leverage with the Americans, I think it's understandable that she's crying foul about that. It isn't a popular view that I'm advancing, the idea that they're not undermining Team Canada, but I don't think there is a Team Canada. So what else are they supposed to do?
Daniel, you're nodding.
Yes. Eventually there will be a federal response, and I think it's going to be coming soon and informed by the position of the premiers, I hope. So I think eventually we're going to be forced to have a Team Canada approach because there's going to be a Canadian federal response. It will certainly involve the premiers. But I was nodding because the reference to the fact that Canadian federal policy has not been very kind to oil and gas and natural resource development in general. And this is coming back to haunt us, frankly. So we saw just recently the Trans Mountain Pipeline open. And finally, we got a surge of exports, oil and gas, in this case, oil exports, to our Asian markets, which we've been waiting for a long time. And there's going to be some LNG exports. The current situation, or just prior to that, the situation was that we were bottlenecked and our energy exports had to go to the US at a steep discount. And I agree with people who are saying that actually far from the U.S. subsidizing us, we're subsidizing them through our actions there that make the price of oil, Canadian oil, in the U.S. very cheap. And the U.S. has an oil and gas surplus in general with the rest of the world. And part of the reason for that is because they can import a lot of cheap oil from Canada. So I completely agree that there is of course, very different views across the country as to what the approach and the response should be, and that the premiers will have their own individual approaches. For example, the LCBO here in Ontario, or the Société des Alcools au Québec, they will have control over what they put on the shelves and what they don't put on the shelves. And you can bet that there's going to be some retaliation or some blocking of U.S. wines in this case, for example, which of course goes against our trade agreements. But of course, we're not the first ones to go against the trade agreements, as Meredith mentioned. Once you start a war, you got to expect to get some blows back. But the big ones are going to come at the federal level, I feel. And there's a gradation of things they can do, but it's going to start with obviously some tariffs on U.S. goods themselves that are easily substitutable. Instead of buying Florida orange juice, we buy orange juice from Brazil, for example, that sort of thing, because all of a sudden there's going to be a tariff on Florida orange juice, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not going to mess with all of the U.S. imports, that's for sure, because we need them for our own industry, regardless of the fact that they have a tariff on us. But the federal response is going to be, I think, pretty significant, and it's going to be the starting gun for all the others.
So with that in mind, Meredith, have you hit on the key point? Like, in a trade war scenario, is our energy our key weapon against Donald Trump?
Energy is certainly an important area, and I don't think that anything should be taken off the table at this time. There's oil and gas. There's also Canadian electricity exports. A number of U.S. states rely on electricity, particularly in the kind of northeast of the U.S. They rely on electricity from Ontario and Quebec, and they require that. It's cold. It is winter. And so we're not just talking about, your lights going out. We do have influence there for sure. And, this kind of talk is actually quite uncomfortable for Canadians. We don't like thinking in these terms, but we're in unusual times. Other types of natural resources where we do have a lot of leverage is in the area of critical minerals. There are specific critical minerals that China has they placed a ban on exporting those to the United States. And so if the United States needs those critical minerals, then Northwest Canada is among the only place that those can be sourced. 87% of American imports of potash come from the province of Saskatchewan, and their only other option is Russia. And so if they're not buying potash from us, they're buying potash from Russia, and that would violate sanctions and, of course, undermine working with Ukraine on the war against Russia. And so, there are options that we have. We don't like speaking in those terms, but we are not without leverage.
So are there sectors that would benefit and would not benefit at the end of the day? What do the casualties look like? I think back to when Trump ripped up NAFTA. We found that the Canadian automotive industry walked away from that with an even better deal than the one they had under NAFTA, according to Flavio Volpe of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association, who was in the room for the negotiations with Chrystia Freeland. Do we have to look at certain sectors and say, well, they're going to suffer and these ones are going to benefit?
Well, I know Flavio and I like him, but he does represent the parts sector, which is not the auto sector. Well, and it's an important point because, in fact, you never heard from the auto sector throughout the entire renegotiation of NAFTA. I'm not sure that, Big A Autos was thrilled with the renegotiation of NAFTA. However, the parts people were. And so I make that point because it is important to pay close attention to who is talking and who is not talking in these moments. And so he did a very good job advancing the interests of his part of the sector. But there are other parts of the auto sector that I don't think are thrilled with the outcome of the new NAFTA agreement. Having said that, the auto sector actually stands to be really, really damaged if we end up in 25% tariffs because the average vehicle crosses the Canada-US border 8 times in the course of assembly. So just picture what that looks like as you're exporting and re-exporting and how are the tariffs going to work in that case. Those arguments have been advanced to President-elect Trump. I think a little bit of what it misses is the logic of why he's considering this. So he actually, as Daniel said, is seeking to reshore auto manufacturing entirely to the United States. And so if this creates a lot of disruption in the integrated auto supply chain, I'm not sure that that's a bad thing for him. It certainly is a bad thing for Canada, though. And yesterday, Premier Ford, I think, indicated up to 500,000 Ontario jobs would be on the line depending on the extent of the tariffs. And he's very much talking about auto jobs and jobs linked to autos because while I think we're in the range of over 100,000 auto workers that are directly linked to the United States, there's still many other indirect jobs that are then linked to Ontario's auto sector.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to be very easy for Mr. Trump and his team, despite their aversion to trade deficits. It's going to be very easy to show that the trade deficit that they have with Canada in oil and gas is immediately supportive of U.S. competitiveness and indeed some of the trade surpluses they have elsewhere. It's a very direct line. We help them there. The difficulty is going to be to make them see that in other sectors. And yet, the U.S. Let's remember that the U.S. has a huge trade manufacturing surplus with Canada, a huge commercial services surplus with Canada. So finance, travel, these sort of things. And auto trade is an excellent point of discussion. It's highly, as Meredith said, interdependent between the two countries, and we are more competitive together. This is the difficulty with Mr. Trump's team. He might look at this trade, he might realize that it is actually auto trade between Canada and the U.S. is in fact perfectly in balance. So the manufacturing surplus they have with us, as in all kinds of other manufacturers, consumer goods that we buy here. And he might say, and he does say, it's not enough. We want more. We want to repatriate some of that manufacturing. But who is going to be their consumers? So that's really the second order question that they don't think about. If they kill the Canadian economy, well, we do buy a lot of those cars. We do buy a lot of those parts. It's not going to be replaced entirely by U.S. Consumption for sure, or U.S. production, especially since those tariffs are going to make U.S. industry less competitive. That's what happened last time with steel and aluminum. And I wouldn't be surprised, that's just about autos, but they have a huge surplus with us in other manufacturing, as I said, or in services. What's going to happen to that? The Canadian economy tanks. So the end result is they're not going to fix their trade deficit at all with these tariffs, whether it's with us or the rest of the world, if they weaken their partner economies. So what I'm hoping is that they're going to realize that soon enough, and there's going to be pressure in Congress and elsewhere from business once the costs to the U.S. economy become clear. The cost to consumers, the cost in terms of parts. They're going to be inundated with petitions like last time with steel and aluminum to actually, from industry, to get relief from these tariffs because they need the Canadian goods. And they might make them realize after hopefully not more than a few months that they also have an interest in coming to the table and solving whatever issues they feel they have with us.
So what's the end game here as you see it right now? Are we going to have to give something up? What is it that we give up? How do we appease this mercurial individual into feeling that he got what he wanted out of his bluster?
So I don't have a very optimistic answer there, but I actually think appeasement isn't the right word. And also, it's not at all clear what Canada can do. If you accept the premise that the reason that he wants to place these tariffs has something to do with fentanyl, has something to do with migration, has something to do with our trade balance, then Canada can undertake efforts to try and address those things. I have argued in the past that if we're addressing fentanyl and migration issues, we should be doing those for the good of Canadians, not for any reason related to President Trump and what he wants. We should have controlled migration to Canada, and we shouldn't have fentanyl on the streets. And so those are good things for us to be dealing with, but not because it's something being demanded by him. But if you accept the hypothesis that is elsewhere in Congress, which is that he is seeking to impose these tariffs because he's looking for a source of revenue to offset tax cuts in the United States, then there's actually very little, I think, that Canada can do at this moment. If the tax cuts that he brought in when he was president last time are due to expire, U.S. Congress has to pass a bill, its new spending bill, in order for him to achieve certain things in that spending bill, including tax cuts for Americans, then he needs to find a source of revenue. And last night, he issued on his Truth Social post an announcement that he's going to create an external revenue service to collect tariffs from Canada and other foreign economies. And the idea was that external revenues should be the source of revenue for the US government rather than internal revenues coming from taxpayers, right? And so if that's what he's seeking to do, it isn't really a negotiation with Canadians. It's actually a negotiation in Congress in order to get a bill passed. And so in that respect, I think the voices that if that is what is happening, A, I'm very pessimistic that there's much we can do. B, I think they'll be coming in executive orders on day one of his presidency. And then I think one of the, kind of key things that we can be doing to try and stave that off is making our case to American private sector interests that will be impacted by this in order to advance an alternate agenda at Congress. But so long as tariffing foreign countries is seen as a source of revenue to offset his domestic political agenda, that's a very difficult thing it's a hard nut to crack for Canadians.
I'm also not very optimistic about what we can do in the short term, other than making them feel the pain, also with some very targeted tariffs on their products. In the medium term, I think that we can increase our negotiating leverage. For example, by finalizing the negotiations with the UK on a trade agreement, which would give the UK there's going to be an outcry from dairy farmers, but I think we need to get there at some point. Give the UK more access to our cheese market, which then we can turn to the US, and we can do this in a number of areas and say, gee, we had to give it to others. Too bad. Here's what you could have, right? And similarly, Canada could start diversifying its energy exports and tell the US, actually, it was good for you, but bad for us that we were bottlenecked and had to sell our oil and gas to you. Now we're going to try to sell it at a higher price to others, and there might be less available for you. So there's those kind of leverage that we can start building, if you will, actions that will give us medium-term leverage. There's also Meredith really is the expert there, but there was a forthcoming a review of the USMCA, the CUSMA, as we call it here in Canada, and the Americans certainly would have had a list of demands there, and we could see if we want to accelerate this process, wrap it up in whatever's going to happen within the next few weeks, and say, look, we could talk about these issues. We want to be constructive about these issues, but really, our best bet is the impact that these tariffs are going to have on the U.S.'s own economy. So he may raise more tariff revenues, but other revenues might fall. Economic activity is not going to be higher. Inflation is going to be higher, and therefore interest rates are going to be higher in the U.S. So he's not going to raise. Analyses from the U.S. show that he's not going to raise as much revenues as he's going to lose from this, simply because economic activity in the U.S., which is a lot more dependent on trade with Canada than I think this theory that we talked about at the beginning of having balanced trade, that this theory implies. The theory that they're working from doesn't consider those second order effects of loss of U.S. competitiveness. It's a real tough world out there for U.S. businesses, and I think they need partners. And partner number one is us. So I think that's what I'm relying on. Is that eventually is the U.S. own realization at some point in the process, whether it's now or in 2 years, that this is not good for them, and they're going to ease up.
If there was one thing you wanted the listener of this conversation to walk away with, what would it be?
Canadian leadership needs to be working together to find a set of responses that are meaningful and that target American interests and American consumers rather than Canadians. We don't need life to be more expensive for Canadians right now. And so doing that in a measured and targeted way that most impacts U.S. leaders is really the best approach.
The theory under which Mr. Trump operates, which is that tariffs are going to correct the trade balance with Canada or anyone else, is false. It's not going to work. There are other factors at work, including, that impact U.S. competitiveness. And so we need to impress on our friends and neighbors and find all the instances that are not difficult to find in which trade with Canada, products from Canada, actually help their competitiveness, and that we have a joint competitiveness agenda to take care of vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And we are better off doing that together. In fact, that's probably the only way we can do it really seriously.
Meredith, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Meredith Lilly is an associate professor and Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University. And Daniel Schwanin is the Senior Vice President of the C.D. Howe Institute. For further insight into the impact of Trump's tariffs, a trade war, and how Canada should respond, visit the all-new cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Ainsworth. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Ainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.